Hello Batman fans, it is time to animate the Penguin / the Batman, the tutorial title animation, and it's coming from me. That's right, I'm making this tutorial and you're gonna come along with me to produce something like the Catman. Here we go, research time it is, and I'm starting off by just trying to figure out what kind of font they use, and this turns out to be actually a pretty easy answer. There is an official font that is a paid one, but I did come across a free font that I felt like was good enough, so we'll stick with that for this tutorial. I also came across this Batman typeface logo kind of thing generator online, which is kind of fun, so I can input Batman or test. Pretty cool. And I want to give a shout out to the person that put this together. Here's the GitHub page. I'll also link this in the description, but pretty neat. So it's time to become the world's greatest detective, and we'll do this by analyzing all the different title animations from both the original Batman trailer, but also the new upcoming Penguin TV show. And this whole thing is supposed to be airing on this new exciting streaming channel called Max. We'll see if they end up sticking with that name depending on when you're watching this tutorial in the future. Maybe they've gone back and called it HBO something. So we're turning on the Batman soundtrack. Very important part of this whole tutorial is having that in your headphones, and I'm using the free font that I found called Compacta, and I'll link this in the description as well. It's close enough. There are a few minor differences on this font and the official one that seems to be used on the titles, and the main one is the G in the word penguin, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So I'm just sizing it up, sizing it down, playing around with the tracking to try to line it up as closely as possible. I'm mainly using the original title card as a reference. Doesn't need to be exact, but we'll do our best to try to match it as much as possible. And I'm just writing big white block letters for now, so I can clearly see how they're related to the original trailer footage they have in the background, and I've just turned down the opacity of that footage to around 20% or so. And here you can see the big difference of most of the letters looking about the same except for that little hook on the G. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later on. And now I'm just moving the trailer footage up to the upper right corner, and I'm adding a fill to my text layers just so that I can color pick and use the same red color. And then I'll just move it back. Now we'll go to Layer, Create Shapes from Text. This is a very nice feature that automatically creates path shapes for the text that I've created. So I get a shape layer with the T, the H, and the E on separate shapes. I am going to end up splitting this into separate layers eventually, but I have them all on the same layer for now, and I can see all of the path points around those letters, and I can move them around freely. And we'll go ahead and do the exact same process for the word penguin as well. Now, the major downside of this whole workflow is the fact that we just did what we just did. We're taking a text layer and then we're converting that to shapes. That does mean that we can create changes to the way that the letter looks, like on this G, and now we have a G that pretty much matches the original logo spot on, and then I can move the letters around a little bit to just match it as closely as possible. And now I'm going through and just splitting all of these shapes into individual layers. That is just my personal preference. I do like to have all of the different shapes on separate layers because it makes a little bit more sense to the way that I like to work in After Effects. You could probably stick them all on the same layer like they did end up originally, but this is a manual process that I like to do just to have a little bit more control. And I'm using the motion plugin to center the anchor point to every single layer. And I don't have to go through them one by one. I can just select all of them, click the center anchor button, and then we have it all centered up on each letter individually. So the major downside of this whole workflow is the fact that we're converting a text layer to shape layers. That is what's going to allow us to actually animate them the way that they are animated in the Batman and Penguin trailers and make this whole effect work. But it also means that they're not as editable for future changes to the text. So we're pretty much locking in our animation to having the text on screen say the Penguin in this case. And if I want to have it say the Batman or something else, I do need to do that whole thing over again manually, which kind of sucks, but it is, again, what gives us the control and the ability to create an animation like this. And what I've done now while talking about that stuff is I've just created a camera, a null layer, and I've turned everything to 3D layers. And I'm going through this whole section of my references and just looking at how has this text actually been animated across the whole trailer. And I'm putting on my world's greatest detective hat, looking into the various animations. At first glance, they may seem simple, and they are fairly simple, but it's always a good idea to go back and forth and check your reference if you're trying to emulate the specific look of something that already exists, not just base it off your memory or watching the trailer once and saying, well, I kind of know what it's going to look like, and then going from there. It's a good idea to go back and forth, check your reference, and compare it to what the original one looks like. And one of the things that the reference has is a very subtle zoom out animation. And I've done that by just adding a quick little animation to the anchor point of my null layer. And then for the final title slide, it's a little bit more of an extreme zoom out and all of the letters are animated as well. So now we'll get into animating the actual title. So for most of them, the letter in the center tends to be the main focus. So in this case, it is the G. And I am creating a keyframe, and then I'm going to the very beginning, and I'm changing the Z position of that letter to be closer to our camera, and then easing the second keyframe. So I've animated the letter G, the main one in the middle, and then I'm going back, checking the reference again, and I'm not looking at the overall shape of the letters right now. I'm just trying to see, if I look at each letter one by one, how is that letter being animated on the Z axis or the scale. And mainly the one in the middle across most of these animated titles is the one that's in focus, so the G, but also the letters on the very far left and the very far right. In this case, the P and the N, and maybe a little bit of the I as well. So all of those letters are being pulled slightly towards camera in the beginning of the animation, and then they all settle in to be on the C position of 0 across all of them at the end of the animation. But this gives the animation a little bit more depth. Even though it is a fairly simple one, we're using these different techniques to add different layers on top of the animation to make it look a little bit more exciting. So we got all those letters animating, pulling back from the camera and settling into their final position before we start animating the path and the shape of the letters themselves. What we got into here, I have created shapes from my text layers, and this has been done automatically by After Effects, giving me, in the P example, I have one shape for the P, and then I have another shape for the hole inside of the P, and I have these little points around the letters as vertex points, allowing me to make adjustments exactly like this, which in a couple clicks gets us very close to the final reference. And this is about as simple as that animation probably was created. Nothing wrong with a simple animation as long as you layer several different things on top of it, like we're gonna do and like the original reference has. We have a little bit of camera animation, a little bit of zooming, a couple letters animate differently, and then we animate the overall shape, layer some textures on top of that, and then bada bing, bada boom, we have a pretty sweet and very distinct animated look that is immediately recognizable for the Batman and now for the Penguin as well. So really, at this stage, it is just about going through and seeing what different letters would I like to animate and how would I like to animate them. Looking at the shape of the original letter, like the I in this case, kind of makes sense to stretch it both upwards and downwards, or both, like in the case that I did here. And for some of the letters, I'm also scaling them up a little bit. So I'm pulling them closer to the camera and scaling them up and animating the path and just doing various different techniques in here to get the final end result of something where quite a bit of stuff happens in the very first second or two, but after that everything just kind of settles into its final position. And I've adjusted the anchor point animation of the null as well to make the zoom go a little bit quicker. Now I'm looking at the letters, THE, at the very top of the word the penguin, and I can see that those are also being animated, and I want to do the same to my title card. So for these letters, it just makes sense again to look at the letters themselves and let the shape of the letters kind of dictate how they would want to be animated. And in this case, I'm taking the horizontal bar of the T and I'm just moving that in to make a vertical line. For the H, I'm taking the right side of the letter and moving that basically on top of itself to again create a single vertical line like this. And for the E, I'm going to end up doing the same, just selecting all the points on the right side, moving them inwards so that they also create a single line. And those three lines now show up on top of the word penguin before revealing that they do in fact show THE. And again, I'm just animating the path. I have a linear keyframe on the first keyframe on all of these letters, and then I have a pretty dramatic easy ease on the last keyframe to allow these animations to play out fairly quickly in the beginning and then settle into their final form, which gives this very nice look of it feeling like a very natural element to cut to, and then everything settles into itself. For the letter E, I'm using a duplicated version. I've just called that E reference and colored it blue to make this very apparent what I'm doing. And I'm moving the anchor point to the right side and scaling it up. And then I'm using that new shape as a reference for how I want to adjust the shape of my E. So I'm kind of using it as a shape to trace or just move my path on top of it to make it follow those lines. And that again gives a little bit of a different animation to the letter E with the same technique. And then once I'm done, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the E reference because I don't need it anymore. And there we go. So with that, we're pretty much done with our animation and we want to add a bit of texture. So I'm visiting pexels.com to just grab a random texture of some concrete. I'm going to go ahead and take my entire composition and drag it onto the new comp icon to create a new composition where I'm adding a black solid and just calling that BG for background. And then I'm taking my concrete texture, dragging that on top and scaling it down just so I can see it. Now this one is basically black and white already, but I'd like to add a tint effect just to be sure, and then I'm adding a curves effect to adjust the contrast. You can use a levels or a curves or any other filter really. What I want to do is I want to be able to easily control the contrast of the image and then use a blending mode and a track matte. So I'm using a track matte with the tutorial text layer, and then I'm also setting it to multiply, which means that all of the white disappears, revealing the underlying red color, but keeping my black crunchy texture with a lot of interesting detail in that concrete texture. And now I can easily still adjust the curves, I can adjust the opacity, and what's nice about this workflow is that I can visit Pexels again or any other site and just grab a bunch of other textures as well and easily be able to replace those throughout my creative process. So all I need to do now is I can hold down Alt and drag those different textures on top of each other to just play around with a couple different looks, scale them down, change the opacity, change the effects, up the contrast, lower the contrast, and I can get different looks depending on what I want to fill my text animation with in terms of its texture. So we'll go ahead and create a couple alternate versions. Again, this is the major downside to this workflow, the fact that when I want to change the words, I can't just easily go into a single text layer and change the word to Catman. I need to do that manually. So I'm going through and doing the same process. This footage obviously is very sped up, but just to give you an idea of what you can do, and I'm sort of mimicking that A animation of the original The Batman trailer, which has those pointy ears on the letter A, which is a pretty nice touch. And here we got the Catman being animated instead. Now, to mimic the reference even further, we have Batman walking towards a car, but since we're calling it Catman, of course, I gotta get some footage of the cat. And I'm just changing the colors a little bit to color grade it a little bit closer to the original movie, and that's very red and orangey and very contrasty. This is just a silly little animation, but I figured why not spend the couple 2 minutes extra time that it takes to get the reference a little bit closer. And now we got that cat walking towards the camera just like Batman did in the movie. And then to make the smooth transition, it is really just a simple fade. So it's going from 100% opacity to 0% opacity, fading over to that concrete texture layer and also revealing the underlying red color. And that's pretty much it. Now, final step to make this match the source, flipping it upside down, and there we go. And we can just throw a quick little from the director, which is me. In this case, these animations, they're not the main title slide. If we go back and look at the reference, are a little bit more simple. So they generally don't have the C position animated of each individual letter, just a few of the letters having their path animated. And I'm doing the same thing here. I'm basically mimicking the animation that says from Matt Reeves, but doing my own twist on it, animating the letters in a similar fashion, and very, very quickly I can again produce that animation like that. That is the tutorial. We got it done from After Effects all the way to final delivery. We got the Batman titles or the Catman titles fully animated, bada bing, bada boom. If you want to find more After Effects tutorials, tips and tricks, stick around on the YouTube channel, click the like, click subscribe, and see ya!